What is the 3-year retreat and why does it feature so prominently in Sadr Foundation's Contemplative Scholarship Program?
So what we know as 3-year retreat is kind of a hybrid. It's it's not solitary retreat, it's not group retreat, it's kind of both. And if we think of group retreats, we might think of Zen tradition of sessions where people are sitting together all the time. And more often in the Tibetan tradition, we're familiar with solitary retreat. Individuals would go see their student, receive some teaching, and then go off and meditate for more or less lengthy periods of time on their own. And 3-year retreat is this funny hybrid where you have a group of individuals, usually between 6 and 18, rarely more than 18, probably ideally 8 to 12 would be the better size. Each individual in their own room, and most of the days is spent in solitary practice. The days would begin at 6 in the morning, or 4 in the morning, not 6 in the morning, 4 in the morning, and go until 10 at night. So 14 to 16 hours of practice. Different traditions, the structure might change, at least 4 to 6 sessions of individual practice. In some traditions, a group morning ritual and a group evening ritual and monthly deity rituals. So it's a very formatted structure, but combines what is largely solitary retreat in a group. And what I'd like to do is now have a short parenthesis just to give some context to understand the whole process. So as we all know, the Buddhist path is a path of self-awareness. We step back from our kind of daily busy lives and look at our mind, look inside, look within. And this path of self-awareness, as we turn our attention to seeing how our mind functions, what's going on inside, the nuts and bolts of our functioning, we uncover a complex, the complex nature of the conditioning that limits and frames our understanding of ourselves and our world. And so the Buddhist path is very much one of disentangling, deconstructing, and discovering what lies beneath this. And that's where we hear about and we talk about and we ideally discover those qualities of openness and receptivity, of intelligent clarity, of unimpeded creativity that globally we talk about Buddha nature, that basic goodness that is there. So all of that to say that this is not something that is really accomplished in 20 minutes of sitting in the morning before you go off and get involved. It takes a lot of discipline, a lot of practice. And so we have this understanding for serious people seriously engaged in this process, spending significant time, like years, in retreat practicing. But we have this commitment to lengthy practice. The other aspect of this is in Vajrayana particularly, we have a very rich world of method and technique to help us in this process. And there's a story when Kalu Rinpoche was interviewed by Arnaud Desjardins, the French filmmaker and author, who posed the question, everyone knows the nature of mind is utter simplicity. That being the case, what is with this incredibly complex world of Vajrayana Buddhism? And Kalu Rinpoche's response was, yes, the nature of mind is utter simplicity, but the human condition is incredibly complex. And it's to reflect this complexity that we have this very rich and complex world of method and technique, of skillful means in the Vajrayana tradition. And so in 3-year retreat, what you have is this group retreat which structures one's time. And for an individual who wants to engage in serious practice, as we often say, it's kind of a boot camp for yogis. It's a way of being introduced to very serious, disciplined, framed, structured situation where one is contained, as it were, engaging in these practices. So you have a structure that supports us in this engagement. And one in 3-year retreat, depending on the tradition, is able to move through an introduction to the range of method and technique that is available to us to accomplish this task. In another way, the 3-year retreat is as an ideal training, and this is where it comes to Sadhguru Foundation, is we're interested in advanced study and practice, so advanced training. It is really an introduction to advanced practice, advanced training. It's an introduction to the rich and comprehensive introduction to the world of Vajrayana method and technique, and also equips one for a life committed to serious practice. The other thing that Kalu Rinpoche, who will speak more about, talking about the 3-year retreat to his students going into 3-year retreat, was that by going through this training, one would be completely independent, free of any need for external kind of advice and support going on in a life committed to practice. So it basically equips one and gives one freedom to pursue a life of introspective discipline and training throughout one's life.
So are all 3-year retreats the same, or are they organized differently? What kinds of practices does one do in 3-year retreat?
In fact, 3-year retreats are not all the same. They depend very much on the tradition and occasionally on the teacher as well. 3-year retreats generally develop in the Kalu and in the Nyima environments, traditions. In the Sakya and Gelugpa traditions, much more emphasis was on study, and then individuals who were committed to practice would practice in solitary retreat. So we're talking already of a tradition that is more limited to the Kalu and the Nyingma. And even between those traditions, they can be different. For instance, the Kalu school has a lot of emphasis on the monastic model. And so retreats often are based on a monastic model. The curriculum in the Kalu school moves through the different stages of practice. The first year involving the preliminary practices, shamatha, vipassana, mind training of lojong, establishing the basis of the first 2 yanas before moving strongly into Vajrayana practice. The second year then dives into Yidam practice and the creative imagination practices. And the third year then committed to the completion practices, specifically what we're familiar with as the 6 yogas of Naropa and the Karma Kagyu, the 6 yogas of Nigama and Sukhasiddhi in the Shampa. And then together with other practices such as severance, Chu, Tara, a number of other practices. Generally in the Karma Kagyu retreats, there would be the ones I'm familiar with, 4 sessions of individual practice, which would move through that curriculum, and morning and evening rituals done together with the Tara practice, for instance, or Sojong practices in the morning and protector practices in the evening. So that's kind of the format. In Nyima retreats, it's a little bit different in the sense that the ones I'm familiar with, a retreat would be committed to a cycle of teaching. And within that cycle, for instance, retreats I'm familiar with, a retreat would be focused on Namchak Putri Purva or on Tramanamo practice. And within the cycle, then there would be a moving through the Maha Anu Ati levels of practice. So there are those kinds of differences. Some retreats I'm familiar with, they're not daily group practices. They're simply 4 3-hour sessions of individual practice and then coming together for monthly feast offerings. So there's a lot of variety in that way. What is common is that the group is cloistered, separated from the outside world for that period of time with boundaries that are defined and limited. generally with no contact with the outside world for that period of time.
So why is it 3 years and 3 months and 3 fortnights or whatever they say?
Well, the term in Tibetan is losum choksum, which is actually 3 years and 3 fortnights. And this is a little bit of the Vajrayana numerology, shall we say. I think it's found in the Kalachakra Tantra, where there's a lot of detail with calculations and cycles of time. And there what we come across this theory that taking an average lifespan of a human individual, there's a number of breaths that can be calculated. And that of those breaths, it is considered that a certain percentage are awakened breaths or enlightened breaths. That is, moments of non-dual experience, non-dual awareness experience that naturally happen in the course of an individual's life. So if one takes all of those awakened breaths and puts them in sequence, then the time is 3 years and 3 fortnights. So that's where that number came from. Of course, individuals do retreats for a year, for 3 years, for 10 years, for 12 years, for 18 years, for a lifetime. So the number, but it was a kind of an arbitrary number that at some point caught on, both for individual and group retreats, and became kind of a thing that was ideally, I suppose one could consider that if in that retreat, one was able to reside in pure non-dual awareness for the length of that retreat, then one would have experienced full awakening in a lifetime.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the history of 3-year retreat?
So as we understand, long retreat is very much a part of the Vajrayana approach to this path of awakening. This hybrid retreat that is the 3-year retreat seems to have come into existence at Popo Monastery with Pema Nyingche Wangpo, the great Taisitupa, the 9th Taisitu. And we know this because we discover about this great teacher who was a great scholar, a great meditator in his own right, that he went into retreat, that this 3-year retreat existed, and he went into 3-year retreat at the end of his life at 61 years of age in 1835. So we know it existed at 1835. So sometime in the first quarter of the 1800s, it seems that Siddha Rinpoche created this hybrid as an advanced training for meditators and for those who wished to pursue a life committed to this contemplative path. One of the kind of, certainly in my own experience, errors that I had to correct myself of coming from a Western tradition where we associate monastic tradition with contemplative tradition, thinking that monks go into a monastery and they meditate, whereas this was not the case in Tibet. Monasteries were more like medieval monasteries in the West, as the principal avenue of education and social advancement in a feudal society. And so that in all of the histories of the great meditators, what we find is those who were really committed to practicing generally had to run away from the monasteries into retreat situations outside of the monasteries. So here we can see that Siddha Rinpoche created a serious contemplative practice situation within the monastery, but protected from the monastery by being cloistered and separated. We know also that, so that would have been the first 3-year retreat, which then spread among Kagyu monasteries. The Palpung, the seat of the Siddha Rinpoche, Palpung Monastery, was the main Kagyu seat in Kham in eastern Tibet, and was very important. And so this then would have spread to other Kagyu monasteries at least in Eastern Tibet and beyond. We also know that Jamgon Kongtrul Lodar Tai, who was a monk and a recognized tulku of Papuan Monastery, entered that 3 retreat, and this would have been probably before 1840, got halfway through his retreat, and then was pulled out of retreat because the 14th Karmapa came for a visit and wanted a Sanskrit teacher. And it was understood that Kongtrul was the best Sanskrit teacher, so he had to leave his retreat to tutor the 14th Karmapa. And in such situations, one can't just go out and go back into a retreat. So he wanted to get back into retreat, and so sought permission to go into a personal solitary 3-year retreat on his own. And he was offered a small retreat hut on a cliff face over the hill from Papuan Monastery, where he went into his own personal 3-year retreat to complete a full 3-year retreat on his own. And that spot is what came to be known as Sadra Rinchen Tract, which became Kongtrul's home, his hermitage, and where he then subsequently created a small 3-year retreat center dedicated to the Shangpa tradition, a very tenuous but highly respected yogic tradition that he felt was very important to preserve. And through his efforts, he became the lineage holder, and Sadra became the seat and the foundation of this extraordinary practice tradition, the Shangpa tradition at Sadra Rinchen Tract, effectively the place that Sadra Foundation takes its name from.
And Kongtrul wrote a manual for 3-year retreat. Is that right?
He did. And it has been published and translated into English. It was interesting, the retreat center that he set up, there's an interesting story about the setting up of the retreat that is oral history that I heard from Kalu Rinpoche himself when I was studying with him. And the story was that Kongtrul was kind of in retreat at his hermitage, and he'd heard about this Shangpa lineage, the Shangpa tradition, which was very fragile, yogic tradition, didn't have big institutional basis. And that the then lineage holder of that was passing through and was going to be in Papuan. And so Kongtrul broke his retreat, went down to Papuan Monastery to meet this Lama. And Kongtrul was already someone important in the monastic community. And he came into the room of this Lama, and the Lama totally ignored him. Just wouldn't even acknowledge his existence and his presence. And so where most of us would react with kind of indignation or whatever, Kongtrul left and went back up to his hermitage and was, what have I done in the past to make that I don't have a connection with this Lama and this lineage? And he was very, very distraught and did did Vajrasattva practice all night, confession and kind of purification. And during the early morning, he had the idea, came to him, well, maybe I could create a retreat center that would establish and preserve the teachings of this lineage. And with that idea, he set off early in the morning back down to Papuan Monastery. And as he walked into this Lama's room, before the door curtain could fall behind him, the Lama looked up and said, that's a great idea. You know, I'll give you all the transmissions. I don't have time this visit, but I'll come back and give you all the transmissions for this. And that was the inception of Kongtrul's idea of setting up a 3-year retreat center at Sadra Rinchen Tract, which became the seat of the Shangpa tradition. Now that retreat, once it got set up, was not a big retreat. There were 5 meditators and 1 Mahakala practitioner. Now, Mahakala practitioner, one can understand that they didn't have clocks in those days, but they knew how long a Mahakala ritual took. So monasteries would always have a team of Mahakala practitioners doing Mahakala ritual 24 hours a day, basically to keep time. And so when we hear that there was, you know, these 5 meditators and then a Mahakala practitioner, it was probably the timekeeper. But the program in the retreat was largely Shampa, but then also included Kalachakra, because Control had become a holder of the Jonang Kalachakra tradition, and then some Dzogchen. So it is this interesting combination of Shampa, Kalachakra, and Dzogchen. In a sense, what we might consider kind of like a post-grad retreat center for specialization. Control had a very interesting life, and he was very discreet, but he had two very, very good friends. These were the great Jamyang Chense Wangpo, great Sakya teacher, whose monastery, Zongsar, was just a couple of hours away from Palpong and Sadra. And another one of his great friends was Chocho Dechen Lingpa, the Choling Rinpoche. Choling was a bit younger than the other two, but these three became inseparable friends. And Choling was Nyingma, Chense Wangpo was Sakya, and Control was Kagyu. And so we see already this fusing of deep respect and appreciation between them. We know that the Vajrayana is a tradition of transmission, of initiatory culture of transmission through empowerments. And Control and Chense Wangpo particularly were very committed to collecting, receiving, and transmitting as many as possible of these lines of transmission so as to preserve them, nurture, cultivate, and preserve them. And this we see in much of Control's work. Another factor of this friendship was particularly Choling was very renowned as a Chertan, as a treasure revealer. And Chense Wangpo himself also was a treasure revealer. And there's stories about how the two of them ganged up on Control to convince him that he was also a treasure revealer. And it's through this aspect of their friendship that it was determined that Sadra was a power spot. And this story goes that it's recognized in the literature that there were 24 sacred places in India. And previously, an equivalent 24 places had been established in central Tibet. But by the 19th century, it was Eastern Tibet Kham that was really the powerhouse of spiritual activity. And so these three determined that there really should be 24 sacred places in Kham. And it was determined, however these things are determined, that Control's seat, Sadra, was one of these 24 places. And in fact, it was determined to be the equivalent of the Indian sacred place, Sari. And so it was said to be like Sari, or in Tibetan, Sari Dra. And so the name Sadra is a shortening of Sari Dra. And so that's where the name Sadra comes from. One of the treasures that was revealed at Sadra was the Songtik Korsom, of which the Kalaya Songtik Porba is practiced in 3 retreats to this day in the West, in the Kagyu and Shampa retreats. I visited Sadra on a number of occasions. On the first visit with my colleague and good friend Ngong Songpo, we pulled out in Tibetan the Control's own guidebook to the different power spots around his hermitage. And we tracked down a number of them, but one that we could not reach because it was totally inaccessible was the grot where they discovered the Songtik Korsom treasure texts, which was just really on the cliff face and inaccessible. So this friendship was a very deep friendship, and this we see in the kind of the culture coming out of the Control lineage. And one story that is told just how close these friends were. Of course, this is the high hills of Tibet, of Kham, and they would travel by horseback. And so they're on one of their trips traveling together by horseback, and probably Choling suggested that they have a race. And so they started racing across the hillside. And when they finally reached the end point of their race, Contra came in last. And as he arrived up the other two, tears were running down his face. And so they tried to console him and say, it was just a race. It wasn't that serious. And he said, no, actually, it was a premonition of our lifespan. And the two of you are going to pass on before I do. I will be left alone after you have gone. And that turned out to be true. So this was very deep, close friendship. What was really remarkable, of course, was out of this deep friendship and their appreciation of the value of all of the different traditions' teachings was the Rinpoche movement. This movement, this non-sectarian movement for which all three of these teachers and other teachers at that time became very committed in a culture in Tibet at the time that was flavored by a lot of sectarian attitudes, to really put a lot of their attention into this non-sectarian movement. And this we find in Control's treasuries. So this is very much kind of the story of Control. Now, when Control passed away, his incarnation lineage split into 5 streams. And these are kind of described as the body, speech, mind, qualities, and activity streams. Of those 5, 4 were discovered and recognized. 1 was never discovered and formally recognized. And this brings us to Kalu Rinpoche. Kalu Rinpoche, who much, much later, as we'll see, was recognized to be this 5th Control, and who played, as we'll see later, the most significant role in transmitting the 3-year retreat to the West. So Kalu Rinpoche's father was kind of a discrete tulku, not a big head of a monastery, but just more of a Yogi Vedda reincarnate Lama himself, Ratak Tulku. Ratak Tulku did 3-year retreat under Jamgon Control at Sadra. Then he was not a monk, so then he left to continue a kind of a yogic life, more or less in hermitage. And some years later, on a hillside in the Rangbatsa Valley of Kham, kind of high above the valley floor, looking across the valley at the birthplace of the 3rd Karmapa Ranjan Dorje, actually, Kalu Rinpoche was born. So he was born in a hermitage with yogic parents. When he was young, he went into a monastery, Benga Monastery in Rangbatsa, and already was precocious in his youth, giving public lectures in his early teen years on the 3 vows. And then at 16, he headed off to Sadra to try to go into 3-year retreat. This is another kind of anecdote. At that point, the Drup and the retreat master at Sadra Rinchen Tra, Lama Norba Dundrup, was considered to be the holder of this very exquisite transmission line, the Shampa, which at that point, at the time of Control, was very weak and susceptible to disappearing. Control took it into his heart and established the retreat center at Sadra for the Shampa tradition. And so the Drupan at Sadra was the lineage holder of this lineage. And the Shampa lineage has a culture that when a lineage holder is about to meet his successor, the protector of the lineage will appear and warn him that this is about to happen. And so the story goes, and this is oral teaching directly from Kalu Rinpoche, that Norba Dundrup was in retreat, not seeing anyone, and received this indication the next day he would meet the next holder of the lineage. And so he told his attendants, even though he was in retreat, whoever would turn up the next day, and this is at Sadra, kind of quite isolated, they should be shown into his room. And so kind of the morning came and went, the afternoon came and went, the evening came and went, and no one was shown in. At the end of the day, the Norba Dundrup was very kind of concerned and curious, and he asked his attendants, did no one turn up today? And they said, no one came today. He says, are you sure no one came? Oh, there was this 16-year-old who arrived with his yak and his belongings, wanting to come into retreat, who didn't want to bother you with him. And that was Kalu Rinpoche. And so Norba Dundrup then said, no, go and find him, bring him to me, and gave him the transmissions. And Kalu Rinpoche then did his 3-year retreat outside of Rinchen Tra. After he completed his 3-year retreat there, Kalu Rinpoche went back to his home valley and spent about 10 years just studying, pursuing his study and scholarship, at which point he decided he really wanted to dedicate his life to practice in solitary retreat, and went off and spent approximately 12 years in retreat. Now, when I completed my 3-year retreat and was being appointed to teach at the center in Paris, after having requested to go off and spend years in solitary retreat, as kind of a compromise, Kalu Rinpoche took some time one evening to describe some of his retreat sites to me. And he talked about one place where he was in a small wooden hut in a kind of an alpine meadow with the accompaniment of his horse. He had his horse with him, but he would never stay more than a couple of years in one place before moving, so he would not get attached to a place. Another place he spent some time was simply under an overhanging rock. And perhaps the most dramatic place was in a cave above and looking down on a glacier high in the mountains of Kham. This would be in the mountains kind of between the Ganze region and the Dege region, the kind of same mountainous region where we find Palpo and some of the other monasteries, but in the higher part of the mountains. And on one of my trips, we were kind of on the ground level looking up in the mountains. We weren't able to make our way up to, but we could see approximately where this cave must have been. Such were the dramatic places. So Kalu Rinpoche spent these 12 years in retreat, and then he was called back to become the retreat master himself at Sadhu Rinchen Drop. And he resisted one request, 2 requests, but at the third, when his teacher said, you either come and do this or you never speak to me again, he accepted and came back. When he was retreat master at Sadra, before this time, the number of retreatants was limited to five retreatants, a very small retreat center. During his time as retreat master, Kalu Rinpoche expanded the retreat center up to 25. So he increased the size of the retreat center and was retreat master there. And so Kalu Rinpoche's life very much was determined by retreat, his own 3-year retreat, many years in solitary retreat, and then managing and directing and teaching as a retreat master, the Sadra 3-year retreat. It was at the early 1950s where Mao had taken over China in 1949. The indications were beginning to appear that it was going to be difficult in Eastern Tibet and in Tibet, though it had not gotten so dramatic yet. But at that point, Kalu Rinpoche made its way to Lhasa to speak with Karmapa about what was coming for Tibet. And in the mid-50s was invited by the Queen Mother of Bhutan to come and take charge of a monastery in Bhutan, where he spent several years traveling to Bhutan in 1956, while it was still fairly easy to travel. And then from there made his way to Darjeeling in around 1960. And that leads into the story of how 3-year retreat came to, how Tibetan Buddhism in many ways and 3-year retreat came to the West. What we can see about control, the control lineage, and Kalu Rinpoche, quality of discretion. These weren't lamas that had important political positions. We're really committed to retreat practice and supporting that with scholarship, of course. So the combination of practice and scholarship, and a certain kind of audacity and freedom of spirit that we find very often with true yogis and meditation practitioners.
And Kalu Rinpoche then went on to create the first 3-year retreat for Western people, which you were involved in. Can you tell us a little bit about the creation of 3-year retreat in the West?
So this was, we really do owe Kalu Rinpoche everything for the presence of 3-year retreat in the West, opening up this incredible door to transmission and of the richness of the Tibetan tradition. At the time that Kalu Rinpoche first came to the West, came very much as a Karmakadu Lama. And when we first met him, those were the teachings we had. The first kind of hint I know I got of this Shampa connection and the fact that Kalu Rinpoche was the holder of the Shampa lineage came when the great Dejan Rinpoche requested transmission, the Shampa transmission from Kalu Rinpoche. Kalu Rinpoche's first visit to the West, he created his first center in Vancouver, Canada, and that's where a number of us started studying with him. And he came back 2 years later, and in that 2-year period, we were practicing and studying, doing our preliminary practices, learning Tibetan, which was necessary at the time. And we discovered there was this incredibly extraordinary great scholar, Sakya scholar in Seattle called Dejan Rinpoche. So we made a connection with Dejan Rinpoche, who came and visited many times. And whenever we wanted to make offerings to him, he refused to accept any offerings, saying, the one thing I ask of you is to give me an opportunity to meet Kalu Rinpoche when he returns. And so 2 years later, and so Kalu Rinpoche's first center was established in 1972. In 1974, Kalu Rinpoche returned, hosted the first visit of 16th Karmapa, and we facilitated the visit of Dejan Rinpoche to come up at that same time. So it was quite a convergence. And at that time, Dejan Rinpoche requested that Kalu Rinpoche give a transmission of the Shampa teachings, which is a cycle of empowerments and transmissions that takes usually 2 weeks. And Kalu Rinpoche agreed to do that and came back several months later, the very beginning of 1975, and gave those transmissions for the first time, the Shampa transmissions given outside of Asia, given in Vancouver, Canada. And at that time, Kalu Rinpoche allowed those of us who had completed our preliminary practices to join them. And so for 2 weeks, there were about 5 or 6 of us sitting in a room with Dejan Rinpoche and Kalu Rinpoche receiving this, the transmissions of this Shampa lineage, which we then discovered. And it was during that set of transmissions, however you understand the justification behind it, the Kalu Rinpoche called us in one day and asked if we wanted to enter into a 3-year retreat. So the idea of opening the door to this possibility to Western students seems to have germinated during that transmission of the Shampa tradition from Kalu Rinpoche to Dejan Rinpoche. It took another couple of years for that to come together. And in 1976, we got the call to join Kalu Rinpoche in France. And that's where we joined in for 6 months, physically working, building the 3-year retreat center. For us, it was all very natural. That was, our teacher giving us the next stage in our training. We had very little idea of how significant this was in terms of the Tibetan tradition. The 3-year retreat is not an introductory level of transmission. This is really giving the full depth and extent of the teachings of Vajrayana. And very few Tibetans were ready or open to this idea, and many were, in fact, very suspicious and not very happy that the crown jewels were being given to these Western barbarians. Moreover, Kalu Rinpoche, from the beginning, said that for him, individuals with confidence and commitment are no different, whatever their race, whatever their gender. And so that he was a Western student or an Asian student, if they had qualities of a good student, didn't make a difference. Men and women didn't make a difference. And so from the beginning, he determined there would be equal opportunity for women and equal opportunity whether the students were monastic or non-monastic. So this kind of very dramatic and earth-shattering in terms of Tibetan conventions. And so we found ourselves in France, building a retreat center, going into retreat, and then coming out of retreat. And what was interesting is the great teachers of the time were all very excited and intrigued. there was a 16th Karmapa. So we had visits of a number of them during that 3-year retreat period. The 16th Karmapa came and spent a day with us in retreat. Dujum Rinpoche of the Nyingma tradition came and visited us. Pao Rinpoche, another great Kalu, who came and visited us. Jammu Kongtrol, who was a student of, was traveling with Karmapa at the time, came and visited us. It was quite an extraordinary time. And when we came out, there was a lot of curiosity. Okay, has this experiment worked or not? And I mean, there's a lot of talk about what makes a successful retreat or not a successful retreat. And of course, kind of imponderables, how do you measure, right, the quality of individuals' development? Even so, Kalu Rinpoche used to say that even with Asian 3-year retreats, the success rate is probably about 5%. On the other hand, he would say that if an individual comes out of 3-year retreat with a little more confidence and devotion in the path, a little more kindness, a little less arrogance and ego, then probably it's been successful. So that first 3-year retreat in France, once we came out of retreat, we met Rinpoche Rinpoche. As I mentioned, we met Dudum Rinpoche, and the two of them then, within a year or two of our retreat coming out, established 3-year retreats in Dordogne, which are going on to this day. Kalu Rinpoche had created many centers, and it became kind of a badge of honor for them to each have their own 3-year retreat. So there was a period where a number of 3-year retreats were established. Since then, other teachers have created 3-year retreat centers. What's not appreciated is that this is not a training for everyone. It's a very unique and special environment. There was a period of time at that time, unfortunately, that in some quarters, the idea developed that to be a good student, you had to do 3-year retreat. And that's not true. It really depends on the individual's approach. There's a myriad of ways to practice, to integrate practice in life. And as the years have unfolded, many of those opportunities have developed. Opportunities for more scholarship, opportunities for integrating practice into one's life. And for those individuals who are drawn to this specific type of training, then there are opportunities for 3-year retreat.
So you entered the first 3-year retreat created by Kalu Rinpoche for Westerners in France. Can you tell us a bit about what that was like?
It was pretty extraordinary. We really had no idea what we were doing. And it was kind of desperate circumstances. When we were, I think, if I could describe the students of Kalu Rinpoche, and in a sense, Kalu Rinpoche himself, the term that comes to mind is audacious, audacity. Kalu Rinpoche was audacious in the decision to create 3-year retreat and open this door to Western students, but we were also audacious as students. And so we got very involved in the development of 3-year retreat. And particularly, we were determined that this be every bit as serious and rigorous as the 3-year retreat in Tibet or in India, in Asia. And so we weren't going to have any kind of washed down version. And so that's what we ended up with. And so the retreat was on the schedule as it would have been in India, starting at 4 in, as I mentioned earlier, and going on until 10 at night. There was no heating in the retreat. And so this was in France, where winters are cold. And we had built a retreat center. Often retreat centers are built as cloisters with a courtyard. This retreat center was built out of cement blocks, which were still drying. The whole cement works were drying when we found ourselves in retreat in December. Humidity would condense on the walls, which would then freeze. So you'd have a wall of ice 3 feet away from you. We'd pour our offering bowls in the morning and throw out the ice cubes in the evening. It was quite dramatic, but they're very interesting lessons you learn in 3-year retreat. One of the people asked, so what's difficult? What's hard about being in 3-year retreat? Is it the meditating, sitting or sleeping, sitting up in the meditation box? One of the things that traditionally was the case now is not always the case. We did not lie down for 3 years. We meditated and slept and sat in our meditation box, which was challenging on the knees first few months. There was the cold, adapting to the cold. There are a lot of things you could point to, everything being in Tibetan, our teacher only speaking Tibetan. But in fact, what was difficult, none of those were difficult. What was difficult was sitting, facing your own mind, hour after hour, day after day, month after month. That's the challenge. And so that's good to know, right? That going into 3-year retreat, one really has to be committed to honesty in that pursuit. One of the advantages of 3-year retreat is, as it's this hybrid of solitary group retreat, is one cannot get too lost in fantasies about how awakened or enlightened one is becoming, because inevitably you'll step out your door and run into reality in your interactions with the others. What's interesting, one learns in 3-year retreat how inefficient we are in the use of our time, because the time is so programmed and there's such little time for personal kind of busyness that one learns to be very, very efficient with time. In our circumstances, because we didn't have heating, food was very simple. Of course, we had enough to eat, but as you sit in practice, you find you need less and less. Sleeping, sitting up. In the early days, we had the meditation box, but later in the retreat, some of us experimented with sitting, sleeping up without a box. And what you discover is the human phenomena, the human individual is very, very adaptable. That we can do without almost everything. That, of course, in winter we would dress warmly. We'd have clothes, we'd not freeze to death. But as the temperatures went down in the winter, it would feel cold, and then it would become normal. It'd feel colder as it got colder. So the body adapts to temperature going down and going back up. It adapts to food situations, adapts to so much. So we're incredibly adaptable. So one of the lessons I know I learned was just how incredibly adaptable we are. And that we need very little actually to be healthy and happy. The extraordinary nature of the practices, of course, and the teachings, discovering the potential of mind as it unfolds, and one discovers different dimensions of experience. Learning to live with others. One of the big challenges of 3-year retreat is learning to live with others. And the incredible kindness of the teachers, of course. One of the elements that I'll often say that practice kind of has 2 dimensions: the vertical dimension, which is the depth. That the longer one sits, then the more deeply seated one can become in one's experience, and that takes time. And one of the advantages of long periods of retreat is the effectiveness of being in retreat develops exponentially. So that kind of after a year, the one more week is far more powerful than the first week. And so there's this exponential deepening of one's practice, but that deepening of the inner seat, or the kind of where one's rooted and seated in one's experience, is only half of the work. The other half is integration into one's experience or life. And so in a sense, a 3 retreat is half of the work. The other half, after one comes out of retreat, then learning how to integrate. And that's one of the big challenges of 3 retreat, is how to come out. And it's often as challenging, if not more challenging, than being in retreat. In my own experience, that was facilitated by Kalu Rinpoche and being sent to Paris to teach, and having kind of a pathway kind of unfold in front of me. But in modern cases, or modern students, that's not usually the case. So those are some of the challenges of 3 retreat. It's extraordinarily valuable experience, extraordinarily challenging. And another kind of fallacy that people often have about retreat and 3 retreat is the one is leaving the world. One is escaping from the world, which is the opposite. One's actually taking the world in with you when you go into retreat. What you're doing is create a kind of a space of sanctuary where you can let all your defenses drop away and dive into that deep vulnerability of that inner work. But it's not for a personal goal or benefit. And so in a sense, in one's mind, one is taking the world into retreat with one. And the point is how to be of benefit to the world after. So coming out of retreat, again, it's not who have I become or who can I become, but how can I be of benefit? What can I do to make the world a better place? And so this very much comes back again to Sutter Foundation and our mission, contributing to the development of wisdom and compassion in Western minds through supporting the advanced study and practice of Tibetan Buddhism.